to be effective. And so it wasn't just all of the things that he did, but the people that he inspired to carry on in that line. He was a pioneer. He was an environmentalist before it was cool to be an environmentalist, especially in the context of developing countries. He recognized that protecting the environment and using natural resources sustainably is not just a luxury for rich countries. It's something that's a necessity for poor countries and poor people as well. And in that sense, he was a pioneer. He was a visionary. He has a lot of ideas that were ahead of his time, and we're noticing that even today. He championed the cause of looking at climate change, not just in terms of the burning of fossil fuels, which people are rightfully very concerned about, but also the deforestation and other land use changes that are major and underappreciated component of climate change. He had a lot of good ideas which eventually became a reality and took hold. One of the first things that I worked with him on was he encouraged me to do something related to ecological compensation, the idea that if some area of natural habitat is lost because of a development project, that it be compensated or offset in some way. And our collaboration on this eventually led to a World Bank policy called Wildlands, which was then called Natural Habitats, which is about to be renamed again as one of the environmental and social standards of the World Bank. And many other development agencies and the private sector have also adopted similar policies. And Robert did this not just with natural habitats and biodiversity. He did it with indigenous people. He did it with environmental impact assessment. He did it with physical cultural resources. A great deal of the environmental and social policies that guide the World Bank and other development agencies and the private sector have Robert's fingerprints, maybe his footprints too. And they're a lasting legacy to his work and his passion. He also had a real sense of urgency. He saw that I think he knew that his time on Earth, like everybody's, is limited, and he wanted to make the most of it. He was incredibly prolific. He wrote very quickly. Every time I talked to him, he had another paper in mind that he was producing to get published and wanted comments. And he had such a work ethic that certainly rubbed off on a lot of us. We were inspired by that, and he motivated us to do our best in a similar effort. And then finally, I just want to say that he left us too soon. I was shocked to hear that he had passed away, but I take some comfort in knowing that when he did, he was doing what he really loved. A few days before he passed away, he was hiking in the Himalayas with his wife and his son, the people he loved most. And so that's not a bad way to finish a really wonderful and exceptional life. So thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Dr. Ledec. Can I now call on Dr. Aggie Kiss to say a few words? Is Aggie Kiss here? I see. Okay. I'm sorry, wish you the best quick recovery. Can I request now Mr. Michael Cernea to say a few words?
Thank you. Robert Goodland was my neighbor in my office, and my office and his office were next to each other for several years. And we shared many other things in common, both ideas and events of life. I had the chance or the privilege to be the first ever sociologist which the bank dared to hire. Perhaps it was a mistake, but it happened. And then it had the first Ecologist, and Robert was selected, an extraordinary choice. So we were in separate parts of the bank, but we soon discovered each other. At that time, I was involved in preparing the first social policy ever of the World Bank, the one on resettlement. And the background of that is very interesting. Sometimes important positive changes come from crisis, and crises turn to be midwives of certain positive things. This is what happened at that time. The bank had a project in Brazil, Sobradinho Dam, and that project was prepared like many other projects before, without any component dealing with the population which had to be displaced from the reservoir of Sobradinho. The Brazilian didn't put that in the project, the bank didn't put that in the project because it didn't used to be part of the project. At that time, it was accepted that displacement of those people from a reservoir is the collateral damage, which is justified because we had such a big and positive thing, which is the dam. Well, Sobradinho Dam somehow did not pass unnoticed because people didn't move, but the engineers unusually finished the dam on time. And then they started to allow the water to come in, but the people were still living around the river. And the concern started immediately to arise. The bank didn't hear immediately about that because according to the habit at that time, resettlement was, the people who were in the right of way had to be moved next village or next county, and the local administration had to take care of that, not even the central administration, no matter how many they were, thousands or tens of thousands, like it happened in Sobradinho, where about 60,000 people had to be displaced from the reservoir. It was such a big thing that the Catholic Church of Brazil got involved and started a big campaign protesting, and in no time, headlines were all over the world about the fact that Brazil and the World Bank are about to drown tens of thousands of people who they didn't prepare, for which there was no preparation for resettlement. This, of course, caught the attention of the bank. There was McNamara was the president. He sent some people on emergency missions, but nothing could be done. It was already too late. The number of people was very big. Everybody was caught by surprise because this was the pattern. Nobody challenged that pattern before. Sobradinho was not, so to say, the fault of the bank, an omission, or it was a practice to not plan for people who are displaced. Well, in the wake of this thing, it was shortly after I joined the bank, and I learned about Sobradinho. I went to my manager at that time, Monty Ullman, who passed away recently too, and I proposed to write some social guidelines so that future dam projects do not go through the same disasters. This is how the 5 guidelines were written, and then we started discussion all over the bank, and encountered difficulties, opposition from some, very much support from others. A lot of people said it should not be the responsibility of the bank. The bank doesn't have capacity, doesn't have to care about this. It's a local issue, local population. Management did not embrace that thing. I eventually finished the guidelines, and it started to go up the chain of command from our department. It went to Warren Baum, which surprisingly didn't send the text back with a lot of red marks, as was his habit, and he sent it to McNamara, and lo and behold, after several days, McNamara approved it and indicated that it should not be simple technical guidelines, it should become a bank policy. This is how the famous 233 was enacted as a bank policy on resettlement, in which the major change, I mean, there are many changes compared to the practice before, but the major change was that resettlement, it was decided, should be a component of the bank finance project. Borrowers should ask to prepare plans and to include in the project. The bank will finance a project which includes that no externalization of resettlement any longer, displacement, in fact, any longer outside. This is how it happened. In the process, Robert Goodland came, and then is when we got to know each other a bit, and said, how come sociologists deal with the displacement of people? This in dams is typically an environmental issue. So we explained, and he was happy that there was another force in the bank who was dealing with it. Since then, started our collaboration. After that, we engaged further. I started to work on the social analysis policy, which had to be introduced. The bank didn't have any policy on social analysis. And Robert was very concerned with indigenous people. And he said he would like to start to work to prepare guidelines for indigenous people. That was his initiative. Although it was a social issue. But this is the type of environmentalist Robert was. One which was dealing with, which was a human environmentalist, so to say, was very concerned about the people and said all the time that the environment is for the people and the people should be protected. So he prepared, he brought another colleague, Sandy Davis, who unfortunately also passed away, an anthropologist, and the draft was prepared, was discussed, and again there was opposition. There was a manager already named at that time for the environment, who was Robert's boss, and he was very hesitant to go ahead and propose guidelines. Eventually, we reached an understanding. I had a sociological group which was meeting regularly, almost every month. Let's put the text in the discussion of the group, and if the group is supporting it as a group, then we can go to management, said that manager. And this is how it happened. The policy went to management, and it was approved, and 2.5 years later, after the resettlement policy, we had that policy on indigenous people, who turned out to be, together with the displacement resettlement policy, one of the most lasting and important policies for everything the bank did forward, subsequently. Very difficult problems, but which came up on the public agenda, not only in the development narrow agenda. And the bank was prepared by having two policy frameworks to deal with that. No other agency had a framework like that. No regional banks, nobody else. But gradually they started to replicate what we did with the bank, and our policies became template for similar policies in other regional development banks. It took them time. ADB took 15 years until it accepted to have a resettlement policy on its own. It was at that time another disaster who determined them. It was the debacle of Narmada, which was in Asia, and after ADB saw what happened in Narmada, they immediately rushed to have a displacement policy. Well, what I want to extract from that is an issue of human environmentalism, in which I found in Robert always an important colleague and very powerful colleague. Yes. I have indeed more to say, but I will say that I saw him in the field and in the daily thing. That is important because this is how Robert was as a person. in the bank, Robert was always the first to come. At 7:30, he was in the office. No matter when the others arrived, they found him there. He worked consistently, strongly, and left the bank punctually because he had to do other work. And once I asked him, so this is my second day, he said, I have to work to read, I have to write. And please note that Robert Goodland left not only many memories, recollection, but left an important written heritage. So I'd like to end on this note and to say that I wish that the Robert examples is followed today by all environmentalists and by the institutions which deal with environmentalism and with climate change, and the collaboration between environmentalists and social scientists be fostered as a real fundamental stone, cornerstone for everything which has to be done in the environment. Thank you.
Request Dr. Mishra to say a few words. He's come from Nepal. He's from Nepal, and he's been a very good friend of Dr. Goodland.
Yeah, and Robert used to love Nepal very much. Robert used to love Nepal very much. And so did Arthur and John Manning. Well, good evening. Where shall I start? I first met Robert Goodland in a very bucolic setting in the island of Bali in Indonesia. Lee, you were also there. I think it was one of the IUCN's protected areas meeting. Then I was an ecocrat working in Nepal. It's a combination between a bureaucrat and an ecologist. While Robert was the first ecologist to work for the World Bank here in Washington, D.C. When I first met Robert, I had really very bad view, very jaundiced view of the World Bank. While Robert did not react to any of our criticism in Bali, he did radiate a very different persona of the people who worked for the World Bank, and I had to change my opinion. We in Bali then found Robert Goodland was the human face of the World Bank, humble, gentle, quiet, non-confrontational, and basically a good listener. If not at the receiving end, we were often given more lectures. Though we were as qualified as anybody who came from the bank, you know. We also went to Ivy League colleges in the West. In weeks' time, the conference ended, and I didn't meet Robert except through a good friend, a very famous filmmaker called Adrian Cowell, who did The Decade of Destruction in Brazil. We somehow or other used to communicate. Well, somehow or other, fate is a very strange animal. In 1992, the bank recruited me as an environmental specialist for the Asia-Pacific region. So I came here from Nepal, and like Alice in the Wonderland, I was swept in a totally different alien environmentalist. I had no idea what I was doing, and I was very much lost here in Washington. Besides dealing with very controversial hydropower and road projects, my task was to work with NGOs. Then the NGOs were the devils, as far as the bank was concerned. And likewise, most of the NGOs were very vocal in their criticism of the bank, and may I say, for the right reasons. Unlike the present, there was very little communication between the NGOs and the bank. But Robert was an exception. He used to invite NGOs, scruffy ones, as you said, in his party. He used to meet them, even if some of our bosses were not happy. And I was quite amused to note that many of the NGOs thought Robert was the NGOs of the NGOs, even if he worked in the bank. But then they were right. Robert was a revolutionary, a logical voice, a voice of reason, and a leader for righting the wrongs that the bank had done in many of his projects. Consequently, he became my friend, my mentor, and my guide. He helped me chart my ways through a maze of bank's bureaucracy, where to step, who not to piss off. In some ways, he had a mindset of a Hindu or a Buddhist philosopher. He was a champion of care, compassion, and kindness, not only for fellow humans, but for all animals. Excuse me if I'm getting emotional. A modest man with a Himalayan-sized heart, Robert was a pioneer in the bank. In fact, he was, as far as I know, the first who linked natural forest and wildlife habitat destructions with climate change. Way ahead of his time, as you told. Thanks to Robert, many of us gathered in this room today have learned that moving the agenda against the impacts of climate change is not only good science, but also like politics. It is an art of the possible, particularly in this country where the biggest polluters of climate change are human beings, right? A corporation is a human being. I've never heard anything absurd in my life. Well, fate has taken Robert from us to his new heavenly abodes. Yet, until our bell tolls, we live to celebrate his life and times and his vision for a cleaner, non-violent, and an environmentally secure Earth. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those very moving words. Before we go to the next segment of our program, which will probably focus a little more on the substance of Dr. Pachauri's address, it's rare for us to have somebody of his caliber and status to spend time with us. So I would really request that the next segment could focus on some of the substantive issues. But before that, may I call upon Michael Colby to read a couple of messages that have been received today.
Thank you. I'm going to read first comments from Mohammed El-Ashri, the former head of the Environment Department and GEF. He starts off by saying, knowing Robert, I can imagine that as he entered the gates of heaven, he asked St. Peter if he had prepared an environmental assessment before building the gates. To me, Robert was Mr. Environmental Assessment. I joined the bank in May of 1991 as the director of the Environment Department, and the department was then weak and ineffective, but it had a handful of superstars. One of them was Robert, another was Herman Daly. We embarked on pulling together the first world-class environmental assessment guidelines for the bank. Robert handled the technical aspects and I dealt with the politics. Those guidelines, now called safeguards, were approved in August 1991 by President Barbara Conable. In recognition of his pioneering efforts, Robert was elected president of the International Association of Impact Assessment and hosted its annual meeting in 1992 on bank premises, something that would not have been possible earlier. Without a doubt, I'm abbreviating these because of time, but we'll have the full remarks online later. Without a doubt, Robert was an environmental leader inside and outside the bank. He had the respect and admiration of the environmental community and was the one to go to in Washington for opinions on environment and development issues. He will be missed by all who knew him, but his memory lives on, and our hearts and condolences go to John Mann and Arthur. Second, I wanted to give some remarks from Clive Wicks, who worked with Robert in 2008 on mining in the Philippines. He says, Robert did not hesitate to visit conflict areas where people who were opposed to mines were being killed. The book, I should have mentioned the book they authored was called Philippines, Mining or Food. Robert was a defender of the poor. He loved meeting local people, particularly the indigenous people. He met the ministers responsible for mining and agriculture and told them frankly what he thought about the terrible environmental and human rights abuses that would be caused if they allowed some of the proposed mining projects, especially the massive Tampakan copper and gold mine, to go ahead. He will be missed by all of us, and we'll try our best to build on that work that he did in the Philippines. Thank you.
We'll now get questions or comments from the floor, and also any memories if you want to share them. What we'll do is we'll be employing 3 mics for this purpose. We have one out here in the podium, and then we've got 2 more. What I would request is that people could come up to one of the mics, indicate their names, because all this is being recorded, and then make their comments. Who would be the first who would like to come up? Please.
Yes, I'm Jed Schilling, and I worked some at the World Bank with Robert and subsequently many of the events. But my wife, Jane Pratt, worked with him much more at the bank and worked on many important environmental advancements that were going on. And I give our deep respect and sorrow on her behalf because, sorrowfully, she passed away last year too. So we've lost another very dynamic environmentalist, and I'm trying to keep up on some of the activities that she was doing. I do have a comment on the very excellent talk that was given, because I think beyond looking at simply the temperature change of climate change, we need to look more broadly at the impact of continued exponential growth on resource depletion. Because as we know, if you look at exponential increases in demand, it gets bigger and bigger. The world isn't getting any bigger. So it's a much broader range of issues that need to be addressed. And it's not simply the technical changes of shifting sources of energy, electricity, and things like that. There's going to be significant behavioral changes that will have to take place in order to adapt in a successful way. And as I mentioned, I'm working with the Millenium Institute now, which has developed system dynamic models that link economic, environmental, and social factors and generate longer-term scenarios. And we did a study and use of the model with UNEP on their Green Economy report that came out 3 years ago that showed that with appropriate shifting of investment to various green things, not just in energy and reducing greenhouse gas, but in shifting to more sustainable agriculture and things like that, over the longer term, you could actually get a better GDP and job creation than was possible with just conventional business as usual. And if you shifted to even a greener GDP calculation, the results would show up much better, taking account of the externalities that several people have mentioned are ignored in so much of the conventional GDP that the bank and others insist on. So thank you very much. If you'd like to comment on this and these additions, that would be very useful.
No, I think you're absolutely right. We certainly would require to bring about changes in lifestyles and behavior. And most importantly, I think we'll also need to change some of our values, because without those being at the very base of changes that have to take place, there's always the temptation of continuing with business as usual and believing erroneously that everything is fine. So I think there has to be a shift in behavior, there has to be a shift in values and ethics. And to my mind, the problem is not one that only economists or technologists can solve. Possibly even the leaders of various faiths in the world have to get involved in this business. Because I'm afraid otherwise we're just going to veer off on a path that's not going to be sustainable. And you're right, we are living on a planet which is limited. You look at the impacts on population. At the beginning of the last century, the total population of this planet was 2 billion. And we are now in excess of 7 billion. And we'd probably add another 2 billion in the next 20, 25 years. And everybody wants to live the life of the most prosperous societies on earth. So if we're all going to be such huge demanders of resources and the services that they provide, we're going to run into some finite problems which it's high time we started reflecting on. So I agree with you entirely.
Thank you very much. I did not have the privilege to know personally Robert Goodland, but of course I was in the bank, so I had to follow the guidelines that the bank had made for us, for all of us. Somebody said this afternoon that he had passed away too early, and I fully concur on this, and I am about to explain why. I think times have changed. The world is changing, and the bank is changing, the World Bank Group, as they call it now. I think times has come to address, as you said, the common concerns. And environment is one of the common concerns. We have to address the common concerns. We have not to forget